The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the quiet suburban street. It was a picture-perfect evening, except for the constant nagging feeling of irritation that had been simmering in my gut for years. I was returning home after a long day of meetings and calls, the air thick with the scent of exhaust fumes from the traffic. As I turned onto my street, I saw them, the nosy neighbors, Mrs. Henderson and her son, Mark, standing by their manicured lawn, their faces twisted in what I knew was a mix of disapproval and disdain. They'd been giving my parents, and me by extension, the cold shoulder ever since I moved back home. It was hard to blame them, really. I was a bit of an anomaly. I was a successful entrepreneur, running a thriving tech company, but I preferred to live a simple life. My clothing was usually jeans and a t-shirt, and I rode a beat-up motorcycle to work. My parents, bless their hearts, were always trying to explain my quirks to the neighbors, but their attempts were met with raised eyebrows and skeptical looks. The Hendersons, you see, were the epitome of upper-middle-class suburbia. They were always dressed to the nines, drove a fancy SUV, and had a social calendar that was packed with charity events and cocktail parties. Their lives were a whirlwind of perfection, and they couldn't understand why I wouldn't embrace the same lifestyle. "That's your son," Mrs. Henderson once said to my mother, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "He looks different." "Oh, he's just a simple guy," my mother had replied, trying to brush it off. That simple guy had just closed a deal with a major investor, putting my company on the fast track to becoming a multi-million-dollar enterprise. But the Hendersons wouldn't know that. They didn't understand the nuances of the tech world, and they certainly didn't understand me. The day one finally had enough, I was returning home from a conference in San Francisco. My parents were out, so I decided to stop by the local diner, a cozy spot where I'd spent many a lazy afternoon growing up. As I was finishing my coffee, I overheard a conversation at the next table. It was Mrs. Henderson and Mark, and they were talking about me. "That son of theirs, he's just a bum," Mrs. Henderson said, her voice laced with venom. "He's probably mooching off his parents. He's probably trying to be a rebellious artist or something. They all think they're so cool," Mark chimed in. The blood drained from my face. I couldn't believe they were saying this. I was not a bum. I was a successful entrepreneur. I was not mooching off my parents. I was simply living a simple life that made me happy. That was it. I had had enough. I stood up, my hands trembling with anger. "Excuse me," I said, my voice cold and steady. "I couldn't help but overhear your conversation. And I wouldn't say that I'm a bum." The Hendersons stopped talking, their eyes widening in shock. "I happen to be a successful entrepreneur. I'm not mooching off my parents. In fact, I've been contributing to my parents' well-being for years now. You don't seem to know much about me, so how about we get to know each other better?" I pulled out a business card, my company's logo gleaming under the diner's fluorescent light. "I run a tech company, the biggest one in this state, actually. I'm a big believer in giving back, and I've been sponsoring a local charity for years. What's your favorite charity? I might just donate in your name." The Hendersons were speechless. They didn't know what to say. Mrs. Henderson's face was a mixture of shock and shame. "I'm sorry," Mark mumbled, his voice barely audible. "I'm truly sorry, Mrs. Henderson began. "My name is Matthew. I'd be happy to answer any questions you have about my company," I said. "And if you like, I'd be happy to take you on a tour of the office sometime. I think you'd be impressed by the work we're doing." The Hendersons were still stunned. They mumbled apologies and excuses, but I knew they were completely caught off guard. It felt so good to finally set the record straight. I walked out of the diner, the sun warming my back, a new sense of confidence welling up inside me. I had always been comfortable with myself, but now I knew that I was more than just a simple guy. I was a man who was making a difference in the world, and I didn't need to wear a fancy suit or drive a fancy car to prove it. The Hendersons may have gotten the shock of their lives, but I had a feeling that they wouldn't be looking down their noses at me anymore. They knew now that appearances could be deceiving. I walked down the street, my head held high, the sound of my motorcycle's engine a defiant roar. I was back home, and I was ready to take on the world, one simple act at a time.